Blackwood Valley, North Dakota Territory, October of 1888. When Anton Mueller began hauling wagon loads of straw from his threshing floor and stacking them against the walls of his newly built log cabin, his neighbors did not just think he had lost his mind, they were certain of it. They watched from their own homesteads, leaning on their axes, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. They saw a man, a German immigrant who still spoke with the thick accent of the old country, performing an act of profound, inexplicable foolishness. He was not chinking his logs with fresh mud and moss, the time-honored method. He was not felling more timber to build a windbreak. He was dressing his home in dried grass, like a scarecrow. The valley was a hard place, a place that did not suffer fools gladly. Winter was not an inconvenience here, it was an adversary, a relentless siege engine of wind and ice that tested the limits of fuel, food, and sanity. A man's ability to build a sound cabin, one that could withstand the fury of a Dakota winter, was the ultimate measure of his worth. Anton Mueller, with his bizarre project, was failing that test in the most public way imaginable. The whispers started at the trading post, then grew into open laughter. They called it Mueller's Folly, a monument to Teutonic madness. What did this quiet, observant farmer, a man who knew more about soil than he did about axe work, understand about thermodynamics that the seasoned, hard-bitten woodsmen of Blackwood Valley had missed for generations? Before we uncover the simple revolutionary secret hidden within those walls of straw, a secret that would not only save his family, but fundamentally change how survival was understood on the frontier, I want to ask you to take a moment. If you appreciate stories of forgotten history and practical ingenuity, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And in the comments below, tell us what part of the world you are watching from. It is fascinating to see how far these old stories can travel. Now let us return to the problem that every single person in that valley, except for Anton, was about to face. To understand the genius of Mueller's Folly, one must first understand the abject misery of a standard frontier cabin in deep winter. The romance of the log home, a cozy, hearth-lit image, is a fiction born of warmer climates and modern insulation. The reality in 1888 was a brutal, unending battle against the cold. The cabins were built from necessity, with logs felled from the surrounding woods. Even with the most skilled axeman, like the valley's respected elder builder Silas Croft, gaps were inevitable. These gaps were chinked, stuffed with a mixture of clay, mud, moss, and sometimes animal hair. This chinking was the cabin's primary defense, and it was a poor one. As the temperature dropped, the logs would contract. The green wood, still losing its moisture, would shrink and twist. The chinking, frozen solid would crack and crumble. Tiny fissures would appear, then widen into gaps through which the wind would knife. A man could sit by his cast-iron stove, feeding it a constant diet of precious, hard-won firewood, and feel a draft on the back of his neck, so cold it felt like a wet cloth. The heat from the stove was a lie. It was a temporary bubble of warmth in a sea of frigid air. Move more than 5 feet from the stove, and the temperature would plummet by 20 degrees. The walls themselves were conduits of cold. A man could place his hand on an interior log wall and feel the deep, penetrating chill of the minus 30 degrees outside. The physics of the situation were simple and merciless. The single layer of wood, averaging perhaps 8 to 10 inches thick, offered a minimal thermal barrier. Its R value, a modern measure of thermal resistance, would have been pitifully low, perhaps an R8 or R9 at best. Heat energy, desperate to achieve equilibrium, would radiate from the stove, strike the log walls, and be conducted straight through the wood to the outside world. The stove was not so much heating the cabin as it was attempting to heat the entire Dakota Territory, an impossible and exhausting task. The cost was measured in timber. A family might burn through 20, even 30 cords of wood in a single winter. The felling, bucking, splitting, and stacking of that wood was the primary occupation of every able-bodied man from the first frost to the last. It was a labor that consumed life itself. Water would freeze solid in a bucket just 10 feet from the fire. At night, families would sleep huddled together, buried under every blanket and animal pelt they owned. Waking in the morning meant seeing one's breath hang in the air inside your own home. It meant finding a layer of frost, a delicate, beautiful, and terrifying lacework of ice, coating the interior walls and any nails driven into them. This was not living, it was enduring. It was a state of constant low-grade hypothermia, a drain on the body's resources that made people susceptible to influenza, pneumonia, and a deep, soul-crushing weariness. This was the universal problem, the accepted reality of winter in Blackwood Valley. Anton Mueller had endured one such winter, his first in the territory, and he, unlike his neighbors, did not accept it as inevitable. Anton's background was not in the deep forests of North America. He was from the flat, windswept plains of northern Germany, a land of harsh winters, but a different kind of building tradition. There, timber was scarce and stone was common, but more importantly, the culture was one of extreme thrift. Waste was a sin. Wasting fuel, to Anton's mind, was the same as burning money, the same as burning the hours of his life he had spent earning it. He was a farmer, a man who thought in seasons and yields, inputs and outputs. The output of his stove was heat. The input was a staggering amount of wood. The yield, the actual warmth retained in his home, was pathetic. It was an inefficient system, and it offended his practical sensibilities. Throughout that first long, cold winter, Anton observed. He did not guess, he measured. He would use a simple spirit thermometer, a precious item he had brought from the old country. He would measure the temperature right next to the stove, then by the door, then near the wall. He recorded the differences. He noted how quickly the cabin grew cold after the fire was banked for the night. He would stand outside and watch the smoke pouring from his chimney, and he saw it not as a comforting sign of a warm hearth, but as a plume of wasted energy, a frantic exodus of heat from his home. He felt the drafts, not as a nuisance, but as a failure of engineering. His neighbors saw a log cabin. Anton saw a sieve. His solution was born not from woodworking tradition, but from agricultural wisdom. What did a farmer do to protect his root cellar from the frost? He buried it in earth. What did he use to bed down his livestock for the winter to keep them warm with their own body heat? He used deep, thick layers of straw. Straw, the hollow-stalked byproduct of his grain harvest, was something he had in abundance. To his neighbors, it was animal bedding and garden mulch. To Anton, it was a building material of immense, untapped potential. He had seen its insulating power in the barns of his homeland. He knew instinctively what modern science would later quantify. He knew that the secret to warmth was not more fire, it was trapped air. The construction of his innovation began in late summer, as soon as the harvest was complete. His neighbors watched, perplexed, as he began building a secondary, non-structural wooden framework around his entire cabin. He used rough-sawn lumber, creating a simple exoskeleton that stood 18 inches away from the log walls on all four sides. It was a crude-looking affair, a flimsy cage built around a solid house. Silas Croft, riding past on his horse, stopped and shook his head. "Muller," Silas called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who had built half the structures in the valley. "What in God's name are you building?" Anton wiped his brow and looked up. "A coat," he said simply. "For the house." Silas chuckled, a dry, disbelieving sound. "A coat of splinters, it looks like. You're wasting good lumber on a foolish experiment." Anton just shrugged and went back to his work. The frame complete, the truly bizarre part of his project began. He selected his straw bales with the care of a mason selecting stones. They had to be perfectly dry, harvested on a rainless day, and tightly bound with twine. Any moisture trapped within would lead to rot and mold, the very thing his critics would soon accuse him of fostering. He began to stack these bales, one by one, into the 18-inch cavity between the log wall and his new wooden frame. He packed them in tightly, staggering the joints like bricks, ensuring there were no gaps. The cabin slowly disappeared behind a thick, uniform wall of golden straw, stretching from the stone foundation to the eaves of the roof. He then covered the top of this straw wall with wide wooden planks, creating a sort of cap to protect it from rain and melting snow. When he was finished, his log cabin looked like a massive rectangular haystack with a roof and a chimney. The scientific principle at work was both simple and profound. The enemy of warmth is heat transfer, which occurs in three ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. A log wall primarily fails by conduction. The heat physically travels through the solid wood molecules and escapes. Anton's straw wall attacked this process ruthlessly. A single piece of straw is a hollow tube filled with air. A bale of straw is a compressed matrix of millions upon millions of these tiny tubes. This vast network of trapped air pockets is the key. Air is a very poor conductor of heat. By trapping it in tiny spaces, Anton prevented it from moving and creating convection currents. He had created a massive 18-inch barrier of what is known as dead airspace. In modern terms, Anton Muller had just wrapped his home in what was likely an R40 to R50 insulation blanket. The R8 log wall was now supplemented by a massive thermal buffer. Heat from his stove would radiate into the room, warming the interior log walls. But instead of conducting rapidly to the outside, that heat would hit the massive straw barrier and slow to a crawl. The straw acted like a thermal battery, absorbing and holding the heat energy. It created a profound separation between the indoor and outdoor environments. Furthermore, the straw managed moisture. The porous, breathable nature of the straw wall would wick any condensation that formed on the cold log surface away from the wood, preventing the rot his neighbors feared and releasing it harmlessly as vapor. He had, without the language of modern building science, designed a breathable, super-insulated wall assembly. He had built a fortress against the cold. The community, however, did not see scientific genius. They saw a fire hazard, a vermin hotel, and a clear sign of a man unhinged by the pressures of the frontier. The ridicule intensified. Silas Croft became the primary voice of tradition, his arguments rooted in generations of hard-won experience. He held court at the general store, explaining to anyone who would listen exactly why the Germans' plan was doomed to fail. "Mark my words," Silas declared, leaning against the counter. "First come the mice, then the rats. They'll burrow into that straw, looking for warmth and spilled grain. He'll have a plague of them inside his walls by Christmas. They'll get in the cabin, into his food stores. It is unsanitary." He would pause, letting the grim image sink in. "Then comes the rot," he'd continue. "That straw is pressed right up against the logs. Snow will melt off the roof, seep down into it. The logs can't breathe, can't dry out. By spring, the entire foundation of his cabin will be a punky, rotten mess. He's destroying his own home. His final point was always the most dramatic, the one that made everyone nod in grim agreement. And what about fire? A single spark from that chimney lands on that dry straw. The whole structure will go up like a torch. Not an inferno, mind you, but a slow, smoldering fire he won't be able to put out. He is building a tinderbox for his family to sleep in. That's not engineering. That's wishful thinking. The community chorus echoed his sentiments. Men would ride by Anton's homestead and call out, "Building a nest for the winter, Muller? Hope you got a good shovel for when that thing starts to stink." The children at the small schoolhouse picked up on it, taunting Anton's son, young Carl. The social pressure was immense, and it weighed most heavily on Anton's wife, Elspeth. She trusted her husband's judgment. She had seen his methodical mind solve 100 other problems on their farm. But the isolation was difficult. The cold stares from other women at the store, the whispers she pretended not to hear. One evening, as Anton sat by the stove, oiling his tools, she finally voiced her fear. "Anton," she began, her voice quiet, "Silas Croft says the cabin will rot. He says it is a fire trap. The women, they look at me as if we are already destitute. Are you sure about this? It is our home." Anton stopped his work. He looked at the stove, a small, efficient cast-iron box he had carefully selected. He looked at his son sleeping soundly in the corner, far from the stove. He looked at the interior log wall, which felt only slightly cool to the touch, not frigid. "Perhaps," he said, his voice calm and steady. "We'll see come January." January arrived not with a whimper, but with a roar. Historians would call it the Great White Winter of '89. It began with a blizzard that swept down from Canada, a wall of white that erased the world. For 3 days the wind howled relentlessly, a physical presence that shook the cabins to their foundations and drove snow into every conceivable crack. When the snow stopped, the cold descended. It was a deep, predatory cold, the kind that found its way through leather and wool that settled into a man's bones. The mercury in the thermometers plummeted, first to 0, then to 10 below, then 20. For 23 consecutive days, the temperature in Blackwood Valley never rose above 0 Fahrenheit. The official low, recorded by the agent at the railroad depot, was minus 38 degrees. The valley began to break. The standard methods of survival were failing. In Silas Croft's cabin, considered the best built in the region, the fight was desperate. He and his 2 grown sons worked in shifts, day and night, feeding the massive stone fireplace he had built, a point of great pride. It consumed wood at a terrifying rate, a full quarter cord a day. Yet the cabin was never warm. The heat roared up the chimney, creating a powerful draft that pulled more cold air in through the shrinking gaps in the log walls. His wife and daughters lived in a small circle around the hearth, bundled in coats and blankets. The floor was so cold it was physically painful to stand on. The inside of their single-pane window was coated in a thick, opaque layer of ice. The water bucket froze solid just inside the door. Sickness began to set in, a deep, racking cough that afflicted his youngest daughter. This was the failure of convention, a grim tableau of suffering repeated in nearly every home, but not in Anton Miller's. Inside the straw-wrapped cabin, a different reality was unfolding. The contrast was so stark as to be unbelievable. The small cast-iron stove glowed with a gentle, steady warmth. Anton would feed it a few small logs every few hours, a leisurely, unhurried pace. The fuel consumption was shockingly low. The air inside was warm, not just in a small bubble around the stove, but throughout the entire single-room cabin. Young Carl played on the wooden floor with his carved toys, dressed only in his shirt sleeves. Elspeth was able to cook and bake without having to huddle over the stove, the entire cabin holding the heat of her oven. The windows had only a light misting of condensation at the corners, not a sheet of ice. The water bucket remained liquid. There were no drafts. The howling of the wind outside was a distant, muffled sound, a threat that could not penetrate their sanctuary. The 18-inch wall of straw was performing its duty, holding the precious heat inside like a cupped hand. The first witness to this miracle was a neighbor, a man named Thomas Jensen, whose own cabin was failing. His woodpile was dwindling at an alarming rate, and his wife was ill. Desperate, he battled his way through the deep snow to Mueller's homestead, hoping to trade for some cured pork. He stumbled to the door, his face numb, his beard caked in ice. When Anton opened the door, Jensen was hit by a wave of warmth so profound it almost buckled his knees. He stepped inside, and the shock was visceral. He stared, speechless. He saw the boy playing on the floor. He saw Elsbeth kneading dough on the table, her arms bare. He saw Anton calm and comfortable. It was an image of impossible domestic peace in the heart of a lethal storm. "My God, Muller," Jensen stammered, pulling off his frozen mittens. "How? It's 25 below outside, and it's like summer in here." Anton simply smiled and gestured to the wall. "The coat," he said. "It keeps the house warm." Before we reveal the moment, the entire community was forced to confront the undeniable proof of Anton's success and the hard numbers that turned ridicule into reverence. I want to ask you to share your own story. Take a moment to comment below with the coldest temperature you have ever personally experienced. What was it like, and how did you stay warm? It is through sharing these experiences that we can truly appreciate the challenges faced by those who came before us. And if you are finding this story of ingenuity compelling, please do not forget to click the like button and subscribe for more. When the great cold finally broke, the valley emerged, blinking, into a changed world. The ordeal had left its mark. Several people had suffered severe frostbite. Livestock had been lost. The community was exhausted, their woodpiles decimated. And the stories about the Mueller cabin began to spread. It started with Thomas Jensen, who told everyone he met about the impossible warmth inside the straw-wrapped house. At first, people were skeptical. They assumed he was exaggerating, perhaps feverish from the cold. But the rumor persisted, growing too loud to ignore. It gnawed at the pride of Silas Croft. He had spent the blizzard feeling like a failure in his own expertly crafted home, while the German fool had apparently lived in comfort. It contradicted everything he knew, everything he had ever practiced. As a master craftsman and an honest man, he knew he had to see for himself. He would not rely on gossip. He would investigate. He would take official measurements. One crisp, clear morning, with the temperature hovering at a still biting minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, Silas Croft put on his heavy coat, took his new, expensive, and precisely calibrated mercury thermometer from its wooden case, and walked the half-mile to Muller's Folly. He was not going to mock. He was going to document. He arrived at the cabin and knocked. Anton opened the door, and once again, a gentle wave of warmth spilled out into the frigid air. Silas stepped inside, his eyes scanning the interior, his senses registering the same impossible comfort that Jensen had described. "Muller," Silas said, his tone formal, "the valley is talking. They say you have found a new way. I have come to see the truth of it." He held up the thermometer. "With your permission, I would like to take some readings." Anton nodded. "Of course, Mr. Croft. Measure where you will." The investigation was methodical. First, Silas hung his thermometer on a tree branch outside, away from the direct sun. They waited 10 minutes. The mercury settled at a brutal -22. Silas noted it in a small leather-bound book, -22 degrees. Next, they went to Silas's own cabin, which his son had kept heated in his absence. He placed the thermometer on the table in the center of the room, about 10 feet from the roaring fireplace. They waited. The mercury climbed slowly, painfully, and stopped at 25 degrees above zero. A 57-degree difference from the outside, but still miserably cold, a temperature that required heavy coats indoors. Silas wrote it down. Interior Croft cabin, 25 degrees. He noted the raging fire in the hearth. Then they returned to Anton's home. The small stove was barely idling, a few pieces of wood glowing inside. Silas placed his thermometer on the table in almost the exact same position as he had in his own home. He did not have to wait long. The mercury shot upwards past 25, past 40, past 60. It came to a rest at 66 degrees Fahrenheit, a full 88 degrees warmer than the outside air, a full 41 degrees warmer than the interior of his own, supposedly superior cabin. It was a staggering, irrefutable number, 66 degrees. But Silas was not done. He moved the thermometer. He placed it in the far corner of the room, the area that should have been the coldest. The temperature dropped, but only to 62 degrees. The ambient temperature was remarkably even throughout the space. Then came the final, crucial piece of data: fuel consumption. Silas kept meticulous records of his woodpile. During the 23-day cold snap, he and his family had burned through an astonishing 5.5 cords of prime, seasoned oak and maple. He asked Anton how much he had used. Anton led him to his woodshed. He showed him the small pile of wood he had set aside at the beginning of the cold. More than half of it was still there. By his careful calculation, he had consumed just under 1.5 cords. Silas Croft stood in the snow, his notebook open in his hand. The data was stark. It was an indictment of everything he believed. Column A, Croft cabin. Exterior, -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Interior, +25 degrees Fahrenheit. Fuel, 5.5 cords. Column B, Muller cabin. Exterior, -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Interior, +66 degrees Fahrenheit. Fuel, 1.5 cords. The numbers did not lie. The Mueller cabin was not just warmer, it was exponentially more efficient. It maintained a comfortable, life-sustaining temperature using less than 1/3 of the fuel. The difference was not a matter of degrees. It was a matter of survival, of life and death, of prosperity and ruin. Silas looked at the numbers, then at the thick, unassuming wall of straw. He looked at Anton, who stood waiting quietly without a hint of triumph in his eyes. He had let the results speak for themselves. Silas closed his notebook. He took a deep breath, the frigid air stinging his lungs. He met Anton's gaze and uttered the words that would change Blackwood Valley forever. "I was wrong," Silas Croft said, his voice clear and steady, a public declaration of his own dogma's failure. "Simply completely wrong." He then looked back at the straw wall, a new respect in his eyes. "This works." That admission, coming from the most respected builder in the county, was the crack in the dam of tradition. The story of Silas Croft's measurements spread faster than any gossip had before. The numbers were repeated at the trading post, in the church, and over fence lines. -22 outside, 66 inside. 1.5 cords of wood. The data was too powerful to be dismissed. Muller's folly was dead. In its place, the Muller rap was born. That next autumn, Thomas Jensen and 2 other families, their memories of the great white winter still fresh, came to Anton for help. He did not gloat. He did not charge them for his knowledge. He simply showed them how to build the outer frame, how to select the driest bales, how to stack them tight. The following winter was a normal one, cold, but not historically so. Yet the results were the same. The 3 new straw-wrapped cabins were islands of warmth and efficiency. The families reported cutting their firewood consumption by more than half. Their children were healthier. Their lives were measurably, tangibly better. The proof was now undeniable and replicated. The next year, a dozen more families adopted the method. Within 5 years, the sight of a log cabin being wrapped in a thick coat of straw before the first snow was as common in Blackwood Valley as the turning of the autumn leaves. The innovation had become the new tradition. The long-term impact on the community was profound. It was a fundamental shift in the local economy of survival. With less time and energy devoted to the back-breaking labor of cutting wood, men had more time for other pursuits, tending to their livestock, repairing equipment, expanding their farms. The health of the community improved dramatically. The constant penetrating cold had been a primary contributor to winter illnesses, especially among the very young and the elderly. The warm, dry living conditions created by the Mueller wrap led to a noticeable decline in pneumonia and other respiratory ailments. It increased not just the standard of living, but human dignity. It was the difference between cowering from the winter and living through it in comfort and security. Anton Mueller's quiet, observant genius provides a powerful lesson. His innovation was not born of a lightning strike moment of inspiration, but of careful observation, methodical testing, and a willingness to question the accepted wisdom of his peers. He was an outsider whose different background gave him a unique perspective. He saw a problem not as an inevitable hardship to be endured, but as an inefficient system to be re-engineered. The principles he applied are as relevant today as they were in 1888. The Mueller wrap was a primitive but highly effective form of what we now call super insulation. Modern building science has given us new materials and more precise language, but the core concepts are identical. A double-stud wall in a modern high-performance home with a thick cavity filled with cellulose or mineral wool is a direct descendant of Anton's design. The concept of creating a thick, continuous thermal break to stop conduction is the very foundation of passive house design, the most rigorous energy efficiency standard in the world. The idea of a breathable wall assembly that manages moisture is now a critical component of building science, preventing the mold and rot that Silas Croft had incorrectly predicted. Anton's straw bales, once an object of ridicule, are now recognized as a viable, sustainable, and highly effective natural building material used in modern straw bale construction around the world. He was a man a century ahead of his time. The ultimate moral of this story is twofold. It is about the vindication of practical wisdom over dogmatic tradition. It shows that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas come not from the established experts, but from quiet outsiders who are simply willing to look at an old problem with fresh eyes. But it is also a story about the humility required for progress. Silas Croft, the antagonist of the tale, was not a villain. He was a man whose identity was tied to his expertise. His ability to publicly admit his error, to look at the undeniable data and say, "I was wrong," was an act of profound intellectual integrity. It was that concession, as much as Anton's innovation, that allowed the community to change, to learn, and to thrive. Thank you for joining us on this journey back to Blackwood Valley. If this story of practical ingenuity and historical vindication resonated with you, please show your support by liking the video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of forgotten innovators. We have one final question for you in the comments. If you were a settler in that valley, having seen the proof, would you have been an early adopter of the Mueller wrap, Or would you have waited another year to be sure? We look forward to reading your thoughts. Our next video will explore the fascinating story of the overlooked mariner's tool that saved countless ships from disaster, a device so simple it was ignored for decades. The information presented in this video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. The building techniques described are historical and may not comply with modern building codes, safety standards, or fire regulations. Any construction or renovation project should be undertaken only with the guidance of qualified, licensed professionals and in full compliance with all local laws and building codes. Do not attempt to replicate historical building methods without consulting modern experts and authorities.